that it's been a great meeting for bringing up history and also busting open the myths that we are fed. And there's no myth bigger than the myths that have been created by the ruling class and its media in this country regarding Korea, the people of Korea, and the Korean Revolution itself. And I just want to go back a little bit before talking about the situation in South Korea now. I just want to go back a little bit because to try and convey the understanding that the struggle of the ruling class of the United States against the Korean people and the Korean Revolution has had a very intimate relationship to the right-wing persecution of the progressive movement in this country. The Korean War was waged by the U.S. against Korea beginning in 1950 until 53. It was a horrendous war. You hardly ever hear about it anymore. The U.S. dropped more bombs on the northern part of Korea than they had in all of Europe in World War II. And this is a small country, one half of one small country. So, it was just an incredible war. But to understand it politically, you have to know what that period was like. World War II had ended. The U.S. had come out on top in every way. Even its allies, of the other imperialist countries who were its allies, had tremendous damage from the war. The U.S. had practically none. So the U.S. economy at the end of World War II was running the world. They had the strongest economy in the world, and of course that meant tremendous profits for the ruling class here. But the country, in terms of how people thought about things, was still very much influenced by the Depression, the rise of the union movement, the struggle against racism in the South. And so there were a lot of progressive people in the United States who thought, well, now that the war is over, we can go forward with an agenda for, ending segregation, for raising the wages of workers, all of that. And then there was the Korean War that was as a big part of the excuse for the government to try and turn all that around. The war, as I said, began in 1950. I want to just relate something personal and political to me. 1950 was the year that one of the founding members of our party, Vince Copeland, who was the original editor of Workers' World newspaper, was fired from his job at Bethlehem Steel Plant in Buffalo, where he had built a strong caucus within the union of black and white workers together to break down racism in the plant. This was a plant that employed 18,000 workers. The company went after him when he led a strike, and they fired him from his job right as they were building up this war hysteria against Korea. So you see, and of course, then this was the first hot war in the developing Cold War. But the Cold War wasn't just aimed at other countries. It was aimed at the working class movement here, and it was accompanied by, massive pogroms against progressives and anybody who fought against the reactionary features of this capitalist system. So, just bringing it forward a little bit, I have been to both North and South Korea, and I want to sort of ease into the question of the conditions in South Korea by mentioning first an experience I had in the North, where the country's divided still. U.S. troops in 39 bases in the South have been occupying the southern part of Korea ever since the World War II, really, ever since the end of World War II. And in between the two halves of Korea, there's something called the demilitarized zone, where it's all landmines and barbed wire, and nobody's supposed to cross it. And right on the other side, on the north side, there's a museum. And it's a museum about the Korean War, about the Korean people about their revolution. I went there with Comrade Sharon and Comrade Sam Marcy, who was the founding leader of our party, sometime when it was in the early 90s, I think. And we were taken to that museum to see it. And they had all kinds of, incredible photos of the war itself. And they also had photos from around the world of people who had resisted the war and opposed the war. And right there, right in front of me at one point, there was this huge photograph in this museum of a demonstration in New York City of Hands Off Korea, with two people in the front with their fists up and carrying their signs and all that. And I almost fell over. And this general of the North Korean army, who was showing us around, asked me why, it affected me so much. And I said, that's my parents, my mother and my father. It was one of the proudest moments of my life, I gotta tell you. So I want you to know where I'm coming from on Korea.
Don't you say who they are? Their names?
Yes, well, Vince Copeland, I mentioned already, and Elizabeth Ross. And she wrote much for our paper and several pamphlets for the party. So now let's go fast forward to today. There's a huge political crisis in South Korea. It has an apparent cause, but it's only a small part of the real cause, and I'll go into why. But let me tell you what's happening at the moment. This last Friday, the parliament in South Korea impeached the president.
That's right.
And the president is now, appealing to a higher court or something like that, but it's the end of the day for this particular president. The immediate reason being given, especially in the media here and everything, is that it's over corruption, which is definitely part of it. Big time corruption. The president's name is Park Geun-hye, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. And she had a friend, and they set up a foundation in the friend's name that got all kinds of donations to it from the heads of big corporations, including Hyundai, Samsung, and about 13 other huge Korean corporations. For the president having pardoned the heads of these corporations when they were charged with all kinds of corruption. So she pardoned the 15 heads of corporations, and in return they gave all this money to this foundation, and it's clearly a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of situation. So that's the immediate issue. But there's so much more behind this. You have to know that the impeachment process came only after 7 weeks of massive demonstrations every Friday. The last one in Seoul alone was 1.2 million people. And around the country, it was more than 2 million people when you count all the different cities that there were demonstrations on that day, the week before the impeachment came. So the mass struggle there has been enormous. And it comes after a period of a lot of repression, and I will get into that. But first, who is this president who's now impeached? She is the daughter of a military dictator who took power in a coup in 1961. Of course, with U.S. backing, no question about it. He sent 300,000 Koreans to fight against the Vietnamese people and on the side of the U.S. during the Vietnam War. That's how close this Korean general was to the U.S. Now, yeah, okay. I'm not used to a printer that can print on both sides of the paper. And her father, when he was the dictator, was so hated by the people that he was actually assassinated by the Korean CIA, which is close to the U.S. CIA, has the same name, right? So that another general who, wasn't yet as well known and therefore not as well hated, named Chun Du-hwan, could take his place. So Chun Du-hwan took power in 1979 and declared martial law. And a year later, there was a huge democracy movement because there had been these military dictatorships now for almost forever. And it led to an uprising by hundreds of thousands of people in the southern city of Gwangju. The entire city actually was liberated by the people, in which the students played a big role in this. And then the government called in the troops. They fired on the crowds, mainly the students, and as many as 2,000 were killed. And then the government got back control of Gwangju. Now, the South Korean generals had to get U.S. agreement in order to be able to do this. There was actually, Democracy Now! Did a program on it a few years back, pointing out that, President Carter publicly condemned the attack at Gwangju. In private, his aides and, of course, the U.S. military backed Chun's use of special forces troops to put down the uprising. And that, the inside story on that came out later in something called the Cherokee Files. I don't know why Cherokee. They always misuse native names for these things. I was in Gwangju in 2004. It was on the anniversary of that massacre. It was a tremendous rally of 20,000 people, and you can get a sense of the feelings of the crowd by what a young sort of rock group sang. I didn't, of course, understand Korean, but I could get the refrain because it was in English. They said, and they played their guitars and everything, and then they said, "Fuck the USA!" Fuck the USA! And the crowd loved it. Now, coming back to more recent, there was a long period where there was more liberal governments and so on in South Korea for a while because of the tremendous opposition that had really pulled down these military dictatorships. But then it got pushed further and further to the right until this Park Geun-hye regime came in a few years ago. But since she became the president, there has been continued resistance, and this is under more and more stringent repressive rules. For example, in December of 2014, thousands of South Korean railroad workers struck for 3 weeks, the longest railroad strike in the history of Korail, which is the national railroad company. They began the strike with an 80% vote for strike. And it was because of the government had a restructuring plan that they believed threatened the privatization of the railroads with the loss of jobs, benefits, and services. And it was one of the sharpest worker-government conflicts in the recent past, and got support from the National Union Confederation. Then Korail fired more than 4,000 workers on December 9th and announced a plan to hire strikebreakers. This President Park not only condemned the strikers for allegedly harming the economy, but she ordered an attack on the union headquarters and to arrest 10 union leaders on December 6th that year by a SWAT team of hundreds of police. Then shortly after that, or around the same time really, the Park regime banned the only real opposition party there was. There are different parties, but the only one that was a real opposition party was called the United Progressive Party. They were banned, some of their leading members were arrested, and their 5 elected deputies were ejected from the parliament. And at that time, the party was reported to have about 100,000 members, and they advocated for the reunification of the Korean nation, which has been divided because of the U.S. for all these years. Whole families divided, unable to ever see their relatives again. Now, like her father before her, this president has used the outdated national security law, which of course was drawn up in collaboration with the U.S., to suppress freedom of speech and to jail anybody who demonstrates against the U.S. occupation of their country or the government's policies or calls for reunification of Korea. All those things were banned. This year, the president of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, Han Sang-kyun, was sentenced to 5 years in jail in July for leading protests against the government's repressive labor policies. He was arrested for, quote, inciting violence during a, quote, unauthorized protest in November 2015, the previous November, in other words, even though the South Korean Constitution, of course, promises freedom of speech and all that. At one time, South Korea had the highest rate of union organization in the world. But there's been such repression of the union movement and such creation of, part-time and what's the other term for jobs that are not temporary, but there's precarious work. There's been a move to, do away with real, regular work. So now, less than 10% of the workers are organized. So this is what was leading up, to these tremendous demonstrations against this government. So now you have this a scandal over these slush funds that the corporations put up in order to get their criminal officers pardoned by the government. But there was another thing that really outraged even the people in South Korea who maybe hadn't, been active in the union movement or in any particular party. And that is that a little over 2 years ago, about 2.5 years ago now, there was a terrible disaster of a ferry boat that capsized, right. It's called the Sewol ferry. And 304 people were killed, most of them students, because it was loaded with students. And it turned out that the government, just never, followed up on anything any company would want to do. And the owner of that ferry boat had built on it extra decks up on top, which made it unstable, so that once it got caught in a little bit of a current, it flipped upside down. And all these poor people drowned, some of them trapped inside of this ferry boat. So that was another factor in making the population furious at what the government had been doing. And everything was, like money passing under the table to bypass all the laws of safety and so on. And then more recently, people are focused on the fact that President Park didn't even show her face for 7 hours after this ferry boat disaster occurred. And they're saying now that she was somewhere in some sort of a spa, having her face redone for the cameras with the wrinkles taken out of it or something. I don't know. That's whether that's what she was doing or not. That's what people are saying. But finally, there's another big issue that has really aroused the people, and that is this thing called THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System that the U.S. has pushed onto South Korea. And they call it a defensive system against missiles. But what it really is, it's an offensive system. Because if you know that you can stop anybody else from attacking you, then you can feel free to attack them. So that's what it is. It's an offensive system. And it's not only aimed at the DPRK, North Korea, but it's aimed at China as well. And China has weighed in a lot on this and said, this is aimed at us. And they've already started to deploy the THAAD system in South Korea, despite widespread protests, and a lot of them by farmers. There were thousands of South Korean farmers who held a protest against THAAD in July, on July 13th.
What's the name of it?
It's initials. It's THAAD, and they stand for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. So it's presented as a defense. But what it is a way to shoot down somebody's missiles, somebody else's missiles. And since those demonstrations in July, there have been daily protests that have continued throughout the country. Some local leaders in this town where there was this big protest, they started a hunger strike and cut their fingers so that they could write the words of the chant that they were saying in their own blood. Some are refusing to send their children to school, and they say they will not give up their land to so that this missile system can be put there. The Prime Minister tried to appease the people. So he went to visit Gwangju, but he never finished his remarks when the crowd of at least 3,000 began pelting him with eggs and water bottles, forcing him to retreat into a government building. And the protesters, and actually he tried to get out through a back gate, and the protesters blocked his bus with a large tractor, and he and his convoy, and this is the Prime Minister, right? They were held hostage for 6 hours. So, this thing that's happening with this impeachment, it's just not some vote in Parliament that is behind it. It's a huge response from the people against this repressive government that is really a tool of the U.S. and has been, since World War II when the U.S. sent troops there at the end. There was talk, of trying to, what the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north says, is that they want to have a normalization of relations with the South and with the United States by the U.S. sitting down and they'll sign a peace treaty. The war ended, how many years ago? It was in 1953. I mean, do the math, it's over 60 years now, right? And still, technically, the U.S. is at war with the DPRK, which then allows them, to do all kinds of things that they couldn't do if they had a peace agreement and government-to-government relations with the DPRK. So the reaction of the U.S. government to all of this is to promote this kind of just absolutely absurd and vicious demonization of the leaders in the North on such a disgusting personal level. And the movies, the programs, and the language in the media every time they talk about the DPRK, and this is a heroic people who have managed to maintain their sovereignty and their independence in the face of all of this and everything that the U.S. has thrown at them. They've maintained their system. It's a socialist system. It's not based on capitalism. They've had to sacrifice a lot to do it and try to build up their defenses at the same time. And they've had rough times, difficult times. But I'll tell you, they are tough. They are tough. And they will not give in to this kind of pressure. So I want to get just to the last part of the title of the talk. The unraveling of the U.S. empire. Oh, yeah, we'd love to see it go fast, right? Well, it's been a powerful empire. And as I said, they came out of World War II on top of the world with an economy that produced half the manufactured goods in the world at that time were produced in the United States. Well, it's not true anymore. Despite everything they've done to try and keep, control over the world economy, even despite having overthrown the Soviet Union and pushed back some of the liberation struggles, but not all of them. They have not been able to maintain that kind of economic strength. The system itself, and we have several books written by Comrade Fred Goldstein that explain in detail why this is happening, that the U.S. economy is creating the conditions for crisis. It's not a healthy economy at all. Matter of fact, and this is really basic to Marxism, the higher the technology, the more that you can have machines doing everything, the less labor you're exploiting. For us, for our class, that means unemployment. For the capitalist class, at first, it means more profits. But hey, who's going to buy all this stuff? Yeah. Right? Yeah. And that's the Achilles heel of this system. And it's also what is preparing humanity to rise to a higher social system. A social system that's not based on private property and profits, but that's based on the collective ownership by the people of the wealth in society to meet the needs of the people. That's what, and the higher the technology gets, the closer we are to being able to achieve that. Because there's no reason for poverty, there's no reason for unemployment, there's no reason for all these horrible things that grow worse and worse under capitalism. If the working class and all the oppressed people control their own destiny and kick the capitalists out of the picture, get rid of them, end capitalism, we can solve all the problems. We can solve the problems, even the ones that some people may be despairing about now, of, you know, global warming and the changes that have been made to the environment. This has all happened since the capitalist system became a world system. The absolutely unfettered pursuit of profits at any cost. The bottom line being, what, you know, how much profit did you make this year, and forget about what's going to happen next year, 10 years, 20 years in the future. That's the capitalist system. That's the system that's wrecking the world. So, I think I need to wind this up, but I just want to say that while you don't see much about Korea in the papers now these days, right? You don't read much about it. Yep. It's not on the front pages, but it's a big crisis for the imperialists. It's a big crisis, especially in Asia. They are losing their economic domination. China's economy has grown tremendously. Other countries have too. But the U.S. can't dominate the area economically the way it once did. This doesn't mean that it's going to be any easier for the struggle in the short run, because it makes the capitalists more frantic, more liable to do crazy things. And now, you've got a president who epitomizes that, right? You don't know what the heck he's going to do. They can do unexpected things that go way beyond what their carefully crafted domination of the world has called for up until now. But they're losing ground. They're losing ground, and the people's movement is reviving, stronger than ever. It will become stronger than ever. The struggle of the oppressed for national self-determination is on the forefront in this country and in many parts of the world. And the working class is going to get back on its feet in this coming period. And I think that what's going on in South Korea right now is a foreshadowing of that.